Hello and welcome to Say That Again Slowly, the Cambridge Festival podcast where students interview the experts who have contributed to the festival. We try to pair up students and researchers from very different disciplines to bring things back to basics. There are no stupid questions here. This year's theme is power in all its forms, from nuclear energy to medieval saints, from the history of money to the biology of extraordinary animals. I'm Ella O'Loughlin and I'm a second-year undergraduate studying Arabic and French, and today I'm interviewing Rosalind Love, who will be giving a talk entitled Lady Have Mercy, the Violent Power of Early England's Female Saints. Hi, Rosalind.
Hi, Ella.
So would you like to tell us a bit more about what you're going to be talking about on Saturday?
Yeah, well, what I work on is Latin written in England, sort of up to the time of the Norman Conquest and just a little bit after. And in particular, I work on stuff written down about the saints of England. And I suppose everybody knows about some of the saints of England, like St Alban and St Cuthbert, but there were many more sort of patron saints of local churches who all had stories attached to them because people really cared about them. And I suppose, in a way, what we call the cult of saints is a bit like celebrity cult now. So people kind of adored these individuals in their lives, and then after they died, they revered them. The big difference is that saints after death were believed to be able to kind of harness divine power on behalf of the people who kind of venerated them. And sometimes that was power that could work for good to do healings, but sometimes it could also be punishing power. And what I've worked on particularly is text about female saints. And of course, in the Middle Ages, women, I mean, we know about them, we know about their lives, but we have this kind of image of them as people who don't have real power. They can't mostly, except with some remarkable exceptions, rule. They can't be priests, they can't be bishops. They're either sitting at home embroidering, supporting their kingly husbands or their nuns shut away. Although early England had these incredibly powerful abbesses. But what's really interesting to me is that when you look at the text about the female saints who were patronesses, those institutions wanted to project them as extraordinarily powerful posthumously. So it's a kind of posthumous projection back to show them as women who did wield power and after death could work some pretty scary miracles, in fact.
How did they become saints? Who decided that they were going to be a saint if it was something that happened?
I mean, that's an interesting process at this time in England, because you might have heard of this idea called papal canonization, so that popes deciding to make somebody a saint. That only started in the 12th century, and in fact it's a process that still goes on now, amazingly. But before that, really, it was kind of a local recognition, somebody who just was recognized as remarkable, holy, and the process that made them into a saint was kind of a mixture of people flocking to their tombs, but also there was a thing that was done very regularly, that somebody might have an ordinary grave, but when it was realized that they were sort of miracle working, they dig them up and put them into a more prominent tomb so people could kind of come and visit it. And in fact, there's famous cases of tombs that are raised up with kind of holes underneath so people could get right in under. For example, at Canterbury, there's lots of pictures in the stained glass at Canterbury of people actually getting in underneath the tomb of Thomas Becket, so they could be really close to the bones of the saint and get their healing. So that's how you made a saint effectively.
So what kind of thing did they have to do in their lifetime to have that kind of reverence?
Well, I mean, it was kind of easy for men. I mean, that's a sort of generalizing thing to say. They had to be holy. They were mostly either monks or holy bishops, or sometimes a combination of both things, who were prayerful and preached powerfully or something. Mostly for the women, nearly all of the cases that we have, they were abbesses of monasteries, and the big deal was that the most loved of the female saints had stayed virginal, And so they'd staved off the world's pressures. So, for example, the big patron saint of Ely, Ethelthryth, or Etheldreda, as she's sometimes known, she got through 2 marriages that she was kind of given into, for political dynastic reasons. She got through them both and stayed virginal. In other words, she didn't consummate those 2 marriages. And eventually, so she wanted to give herself to God instead, and eventually she got away from the second marriage and established the monastery at Ely. And for some reason, virginity was this big deal at this time, and it's becomes a kind of stock narrative that women have to resist the pressures of the world, whether it's her family or lustful suitors, and it becomes like a kind of story that is told again and again. And I suspect it's a story that sometimes is imposed on the narratives of women's lives to give them this kind of tension point, so to speak.
Would it have been in the back of their mind that they could be canonized by doing it, or would it have been something they would have...
That's a very good question. I think that because we have texts that are oftentimes written quite a long time after the lives of these women, it's very difficult to get... what they tell us most about is the people who wrote about them and venerated them. They don't tell us much about the mindset. But I'm sure the women who chose the path of virginity knew that it was giving them some specialness, some inner strength. But whether they thought that it was going to make them a saint it's a very good question. I think what they thought they were doing was vowing themselves to what they regarded as their heavenly bridegroom. And that's also a very interesting theme, is that it's like another kind of marriage, but one to this extraordinary heavenly spouse.
So the people who wrote about these saints, they called hagiographers?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
So who gave them the authority on the woman's life? Would they have been someone who knew her, or was it just somebody who was able to write?
Well, I think it was almost like a profession. Certainly in a lot of the texts that I'm most interested in that were written in the 11th century were written by one individual who had just made it the thing that he did. And it looks like he probably went around the monasteries of England. And he was a monk, and it was like he'd be given bed and board, and he'd write up a hagiography for them because he knew how to do it, and he did it extremely well. And I suspect that his reputation kind of got around, and maybe he took with him samples of what he'd done before, and he'd listen to the local stories. And I think what happens is that people... Well, it's the same as celebrity cult. People remember their favourite stories about, the time that I met Elvis, or the time that I met Princess Diana. I suspect people in the locality stored up their stories, and then he'd come in with the conventions of the genre and combine the local stories with what he knows that you should be saying about a saint. And that's the thing about hagiography. It's kind of stuffed with tropes and commonplaces that every saint has got to be doing certain things. And he knew how to combine those two things: fantastic local stories about the people of the place, and a sense of what the place is like, and then the convention as well.
So did he make up a lot of the stories? Bits he added in?
I would hate to say that it was all made up, but I think what he was very good at is embellishing maybe a genuine story to give it the right kind of colour and vividness. I'm sure he did make things up, because I think that was part of the genre. There are famous examples of hagiographies that are written about one saint that then just have the names changed to make them be about another saint. So it is a kind of cheating genre in that sense, and it almost sort of self-consciously so you and I could sit and make up a hagiography of your best friend, and it would look completely convincing, because all we'd need to do was use all the commonplaces. And it was thought to be sort of okay. I mean, to us it feels like plagiarism, doesn't it? But it was thought to be sort of okay because we're all limbs of the one body. So, you know, theologically it could be deemed. So I think he did make up stories. There's a saint that he wrote about called Mildthryth, who was venerated at a monastery in Canterbury, and she'd been an abbess in Kent in the 8th century, probably reasonably conventional. And there's an early story that her mother sent her to France to study. But in the hands of our hagiographer, when she goes to France, the abbess there tries to force her into a marriage with some young relative. And when Mildred says, no, I will not do this, the abbess apparently shoves her into a furnace, out of which she emerges completely unharmed. And then the abbess rips out her hair, and Mildred puts the hair in a manuscript that she's written and sends it home to England as a kind of SOS, and then she escapes. Now that sounds like a bunch of tall stories, doesn't it? But that's what they wanted to believe about the crisis that she'd had in her life. And that's precisely a story about somebody who's being forced to preserve their virginity and push away the temptation of the world.
So who were the stories written for? Who read them?
Well, most of what I'm looking at is written in Latin, and that instantly, as you can imagine, limits who can access it. But I think they were written oftentimes just for the monastery that cared about the saint. The stories that I've just mentioned about St Mildthryth at Canterbury, she lay in a monastery called St Augustine's, and that was an all-male community. And they were named St Augustine's because they had the body of St Augustine, who was the guy that was sent to convert the English. He was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. So they had a really big, powerful patron saint. And yet they nicked the bones of Mildthryth from where she'd rested, and they really cared about her. And I almost feel like they cared about her almost more than their big name saint, because she'd been this amazing, tough girl who'd preserved her virginity. And the story of her refusing this marriage when she's abroad, it's a narrative of the resistance against authority, and I can't help feeling that they like that, because I mean, when you're in a monastery, what you have to vow is obedience to the abbot, and that's fine if the abbot is just. But if you have an unjust abbot, then you can easily see how you might really want to have a figure that you can connect with who resisted unjust authority. So it's sort of like a kind of streak of rebellion almost, that they liked her because she had withstood somebody who tried to impose something on her that was not what she wanted. And so they wanted to believe in somebody who would work powerful miracles on their behalf.
Yeah. So what kind of miracles were involved in these stories? You got any favourites?
There's a story that bell ringers are ringing the bells at St Augustine's, and one of the bell ringers, he's absolutely exhausted from his labours, so he goes into the chapel where Mildthryth is resting, ostensibly to pray, but he falls asleep because he's exhausted from ringing the bells. And as he sleeps, he sees a beautiful girl coming towards him with this menacing face. And she lifts up her hand and she goes swap, and she slaps him clean across the face with a scalding palm, as it says in the text. And she says, "Wake up! What are you doing sleeping here?" And he's fully awake, so the story goes, and he then sees her. So it's a ghost story, really. He sees her then walk back and climb down into her tomb, and he's so terrified he runs screaming through the monastery that he's been slapped really hard by this girl. And it's because she's admonishing him for disrespect, and it's just a ghost story, really, isn't it? And it's not quite what we'd call a miracle, but still it's sort of the miraculous power to come up out of your grave and and give somebody a good slapping for disrespecting you, basically, in a sort of unwomanly way. If you see what I mean. I don't think that wouldn't have been the behaviour expected of abbesses normally.
Is there a lot of kind of unwomanly behaviour among the saints?
Yes, and that's what really interests me. So there's another story like that about Milthryth, and I mean the title of my talk, Lady Have Mercy. Lady Have Mercy is a quote from a story that's told about Etheldreda of Ely, that there's a kind of wicked henchman of the Sheriff of Cambridge in the 11th century who's taxing Ely sort of unfairly, and he tries to take even the abbot of Ely, he tries to take him to court for not paying his taxes. And the night before the court, this wicked henchman who's called Gervase, he wakes his whole household screaming out, "Lady have mercy, lady have mercy." And he says that Ethelthryth has come up out of her tomb, and with her pastoral staff, she stabbed him right in the heart with this pastoral staff, which is meant to be an emblem of pastoral care. And he says, she stabbed me, and she's saying to me, "What are you doing, hounding my people? You're going to be the kind of example to other people not to do this." And then he says, "She's going to do it again, and I'm going to die." And her sisters are doing it as well, because Etheldreda was buried with two of her sisters. And she does it again like this, and then he dies. And it's not to stab somebody with your staff of office, which is your pastoral staff, like a shepherding staff. It's not really, what you'd expect of an abbess, but it's because he's been harassing her people. So she has the power to come up out of the grave and do that. And it's obviously how Ely wanted to remember their patroness as somebody who, if necessary, could do that. And that's what I find kind of interesting, really.
It seems surprising that there's like ghosts featured in these stories, because surely if they're Christian saints, the ghosts aren't supposed to be part of the belief system.
Yeah, I mean, I use the word ghost, but I think there's a very strong belief in the thinness between this world and the next, that people could kind of appear up out of the grave. I mean, there are quite a lot of, as it were, ghost stories from the Middle Ages. There was because they had a strong sense of the supernatural, and I don't think it's contrary to what they believed, that it was possible for somebody to come from the other world or the beyond back into this world, because it was, in the Bible there's stories of angels appearing, and I think probably it's not much too big of a step to think that saints could do that as well, if that's how you wanted to think of them, if you see what I mean.
Were they seen as kind of like being like angels? Their behavior doesn't seem very angelic.
No. Well, I think they probably were not quite as high in the hierarchy as angels, but then there's an idea, isn't there, of an avenging angel. I mean, even in the Bible, the angel drives out Adam and Eve from the garden. So I think it's not quite as shocking as we might feel. I mean, the Bible, if you search hard enough, there's plenty of, in the Psalms, sometimes the voice who's speaking in the Psalm says, "Smite my enemies," asking God to do that. So, we have this kind of idea of Christianity as peaceable, peacemaking, but the Bible also has a kind of sense of righteous anger as well, which some people find hard to swallow, but it is there, and the Middle Ages firmly inhabited that full range of emotion, I think.
Were the kind of stories of the female saints very different from the stories we had at the time of male saints?
Well, only in the sense that mostly male saints didn't have this kind of crisis of over their virginity. They weren't sort of being forced into marriages. That was definitely a kind of trope that was played out in the lives of female saints. But in terms of miracles afterlife, I think that the kind of portfolio is pretty much the same for male saints as female saints. And that's, I suppose, in this sense, what's interesting is that whereas in life women couldn't be bishops, they couldn't be priests, mostly they weren't rulers, and I don't think anybody would imagine that women could take up arms, but in the afterlife, posthumously, there's sort of like a more of a leveling out, if you see what I mean. I mean, I haven't gone searching for equivalent stories of male saints coming and slapping people, or but I'm pretty sure they're there. But it's just that what's interesting is to see that they're accorded to women as well, and that's how women were remembered. That's a kind of image of holy womanhood that institutions were comfortable with telling, basically.
And did they make up a big proportion of the saints, female saints?
No, I couldn't give you any figures, but they're far fewer. And what's interesting about England is that when they first start writing about the saints, there's hardly any women that are recorded. Etheldreda is one of the few that gets recorded, and it's only in the 11th century we suddenly see lots of women being written about who had lived long before, about whom there seems to be no record. So they have a small proportion, women.
Mm. So was it generally?
It's not surprising. They couldn't be priests, they couldn't be bishops. There's only so many roles that they could have that would allow them to get to that status, I guess.
Mm. So I assume it would have been a higher class woman who
Oh
would have been.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yes, this just doesn't tell us anything about ordinary lower class women, that's for sure.
So the portrayal of saints then, is it very different from how saints now are perceived?
Well, the bar is set much higher now to be made a saint. I think you have to have 2 provable miracles, but you also have to have virtue in your life. I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking of someone like Mother Teresa. I think in a way there's not much difference. She worked hard for the poor, and that's exactly how female saints would have been portrayed. But I don't think there would be any notion that she could do avenging miracles after life, Mother Teresa. That would be, I think people would find that pretty shocking, wouldn't they? That she was imagined to have come up out of her grave and slapped somebody for being irreverent around her grave. So I think that's what's shifted, probably, isn't it? The way that we remember people after they've died.
So what would have been the motivation of a hagiographer to want to write these kinds of vengeance stories?
Well, hagiographers are always they're writing on behalf of the institution that cares about the saint. So the institution would have said, you write us a powerful patroness who's going to look after our interests. We want you to show her as somebody who will not only heal, but also if somebody steals from this monastery or whatever, they'll get punished. So of course it's out of veneration, out of a sense that the saints need to be cherished and kept on side, loved. Otherwise, they can bring down power upon you for not respecting them. But hagiographers are also doing it because that's I suppose that's effectively how they make a living. So that it's not quite doing a job, because I think the hagiographer I'm interested in, he actually genuinely cared about and was interested in the women that he wrote about. But they're always doing it for an institution that's asked for it to be done, I think.
Was there a patron female saint of Cambridge?
No, except that I think Cambridge would have looked to Ely and Etheldreda, basically. So that I think there's a story of some what's called the Thanes Guild, so a guild that went to Ely and swore their oaths at Ely. So I think that's where the direction that Cambridge in the early Middle Ages would have looked for patronage. But yes, we don't have our own one. Although there's a monastery, there was a monastery of St Radigan, which is where Jesus College is now. But I don't think she was the patron of whole of Cambridge.
So did they how were they viewed compared to other groups of women, such as like witches at the time? Was there any kind of connection?
I don't know so much about witches. I mean, I think witches, that's the kind of the wise woman who knows about herbs and healing in life. And I suspect that that's the kind of person that people knew that they needed to get their potions, but they were a bit afraid of. I think abbesses wielded some of the same powers, but in a more licit and less maybe scary way. But I mean, witches are more a feature of the later I don't know how much we know about witches in the period that I'm talking about. I'm sure there were wise women, if you know what I mean, who knew how to use herbs, and they certainly have got charms and potion recipes from early England. Yeah, that's an interesting, and I don't know enough to give you a really good answer.
So how did these stories kind of go out of fashion? Because we don't still hear them now. So
we don't still hear them now. I think it's because of the Reformation. So all the things that happened under Henry VIII that sort of dismantled the medieval church and went round these monasteries, chucking away their relics, taking it all apart, because in a sense, the cult of the saints, it got a little bit out of control. The monasteries hoarded up money from pilgrims, and there was quite a lot of abuse of the cult of the saints, basically for financial reasons. So it was just taken apart very explicitly and put aside at the time of the Reformation. No, that's all extra stuff. It's not biblical. You also saw people going around churches and defacing images of the saints, scratching them away. So it was very pointedly put aside as a practice. I mean, of course, it's been rehabilitated to some extent, and we still remember and there are places that are still so in Ely they've got a finger bone of Ethelreda that is the only thing that they've got left, but it was very explicitly wiped out as a feature of the religious life of England, physically wiped out, basically.
And what was the reason for wiping it out?
Because I think it was just thought to have become not biblically based practice, and too focused around money and driven by money. Pilgrims giving offerings at shrines to go and look at a load of bones that some people believed were just a bunch of pigs' bones, that it was all too based on a sort of dishonesty, really. That's a slightly whitewashing account, but that's basically what people stopped thinking that it was a valid practice, and they felt that it was done abusively and dishonestly, I think.
And what do you think? Do you think it was done dishonestly? Or?
Well, I suspect that it did get out of control, and people got too keen on worldly power that attached to controlling relics and lost sight. I mean, I think having a reverence for very holy people is that's fine. It's what you think you can gain from controlling that. I've got some relics, give me some money and I'll let you touch them. That doesn't feel right, does it, really?
So that wasn't the original intention of the stories, though, was it? That was something that came after.
No, I think that was encourage people to remember that particular saint and pray to them, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And
very interesting.
Talking to me, Ella.
So make sure to follow the Cambridge Festival on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube for more fascinating events, and follow the Say That Again Slowly podcast for more conversations with this year's experts on the theme of power in all its forms. Thank you for listening.